The city of Boston had seen 1,000 stories written into its cobblestones, stories of ambition, of old money, of quiet desperation dressed in good wool coats. But the story that began on a Tuesday evening in late October, on the rain-slicked stretch of Commonwealth Avenue, was unlike anything this city had witnessed before. It was the kind of story that people would replay in their minds for years afterward, asking themselves how a man could be so blind, how a man could look directly at something rare, something irreplaceable, and choose, with full deliberateness, to throw it away. Her name was Elena Wellington Harrison, though in those days, almost nobody called her that. To the world she inhabited the modest two-bedroom apartment on Marlborough Street, the Tuesday morning grocery runs to the Star Market on Beacon, the quiet evenings folding laundry while her husband reviewed his business school lecture notes, she was simply Elena Harrison, a housewife. Unremarkable, by all visible accounts. She wore a camel-colored wool coat she had owned for 3 years, a coat she could have replaced 1,000 times over without blinking. She carried a mid-range leather handbag purchased at a Macy's sale. She clipped coupons. She took the tea when the weather allowed. She cooked dinner by 7 and kept the apartment warm, and said very little that might betray the extraordinary depth of the mind behind those careful, watchful eyes. What her husband Daniel did not know, what he had never once suspected across 3 full years of marriage, was that Elena had chosen every single one of those details with the precision of a woman trained in high-stakes strategy. She had chosen the modest apartment. She had chosen the discount handbag. She had chosen him, and she had chosen to remain hidden inside a life that was never truly hers, because Elena Wellington was not simply a woman living quietly in Boston. She was the only daughter of Thomas Wellington, the Boston-born petroleum magnate, whose name sat comfortably alongside Rockefeller and Getty in the archived pages of financial history. A man whose personal fortune had crossed the $1 trillion threshold in 2019, quietly and without ceremony, in the way that truly obscene wealth tends to accumulate. Elena had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton. She spoke English, French, Mandarin, Spanish, and Arabic, with the ease of someone who had grown up at diplomatic dinner tables on 3 continents. Her MBA dissertation on sovereign wealth funds had been cited in 3 separate academic journals before she turned 30. None of this was visible to Daniel Harrison, and that, she had decided long before she ever agreed to marry him, was precisely the point. Daniel Harrison was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, and handsome in that carefully maintained way that men who are deeply aware of their own attractiveness tend to be. He wore Tom Ford frames he couldn't quite afford, and drove a leased BMW 5 Series that consumed roughly 18% of his monthly income. He worked as a middle manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Boston's financial district, a position he described at dinner parties as senior operations leadership, with a confidence that the title itself did not entirely warrant. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, he taught an introductory business course at a local continuing education program, a role he referenced constantly and with disproportionate pride, as though the designation of adjunct instructor carried the weight he felt his daytime career quietly failed to provide. Elena had met him at a charity gala, one of the few occasions she had permitted herself to appear in her true world. Dressed that evening in a navy Valentino gown, she had carefully returned to her Boston storage unit before Daniel ever saw her street-level apartment. He had been charming that night, attentive in the way that men with ambition can be when they sense opportunity. He had spoken about integrity, about hard work, about the kind of man he was trying to become, and she had listened with the patience of someone accustomed to reading between lines. She had been 32, cautious of men who loved her father's name more than her face, and Daniel Harrison had seemed, at first glance and then second, to be something genuine, so she had tested him the only way she knew how. She had removed the gown and the jewelry and the last name, and she had stepped quietly into his world as someone ordinary, someone he could not profit from, someone he would simply have to love. For a while, she had almost believed he did. It was in the second year of their marriage that the fractures began. Arriving first as small and easy to dismiss things, the way Daniel grew visibly tense at faculty social events when Elena could not contribute professional credentials to the conversation, the way he had begun describing her to colleagues as between opportunities, with a tight, apologetic smile that she absorbed in silence, the way he started staying later at the office and leaving his phone face down on the kitchen counter with the studied casualness of a man who has recently acquired something to hide. Her name was Victoria. Elena would learn this fully later, though she had suspected the shape of her long before she knew the name. Victoria was 35, a sales director at a real estate firm in the Back Bay, and she dressed with the kind of aggressive intention bodycon dresses in colors unsuitable for professional settings. High heels on weekday mornings, a blowout that suggested she had both time and ambition, and a very clear sense of the life she intended to climb into that communicated precisely what she was. She had met Daniel at a networking event in September. By November, she was the reason his phone faced downward. When Elena discovered the affair, she did not scream. She did not confront him in the dramatic, furniture-overturning way the situation might have invited. She sat for a long time in the kitchen of their Marlborough Street apartment, in her worn camel coat, newly returned from outside, and she thought about her father's words he had spoken to her when she was 19, and already learning that the world had a particular hunger for Wellington money. People show you exactly who they are when they believe there is nothing to lose. She was 6 months pregnant. She touched her stomach in the quiet kitchen, listened to the sound of the city outside, and made a decision. She would not intervene. She would not accelerate the ending. She would simply allow Daniel Harrison to become, fully and without interruption, the man he actually was. The evening of October 14th was a Thursday, and it was 8:47 p.m. And Boston had been raining since mid-afternoon, not a dramatic storm, but the kind of cold, bone-settling October rain that soaks through good wool and reminds the city of what is coming. Elena had been attending a routine prenatal appointment at Brigham and Women's Hospital on Francis Street, and she had called Daniel afterward, as she always did, to let him know she was finished. He had sent an Uber Black instead of coming himself, a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class with amber interior lighting, and a driver named Marcus, who had been running this route for 4 years and who would later describe what he witnessed with the careful, reluctant detail of a man recounting something that had genuinely unsettled him. Daniel had already been in the car when it arrived at the hospital entrance, which meant he had arranged to be there, which meant he had planned, in some deliberate and premeditated way, what happened next. Elena stepped into the back seat wearing her camel coat over a loose grey maternity dress, her dark hair damp from the rain, a small prenatal folder pressed under her arm. She had barely pulled the door closed before Daniel turned to face her, and his expression was the one she had watched assembling itself across months of small dismissals and loaded silences, and now it had arrived in its finished form. What followed lasted less than 4 minutes. He told her in a voice calibrated to sound reasonable and adult and regretful, that he needed space, that the relationship had run its course, that he had been carrying the weight of their life together without sufficient return, and that he deserved. And here he used the precise words that Marcus would remember verbatim for years, someone who times brought more to the table. He said this to his 6 months pregnant wife, in a warm luxury car, on a rain-soaked Thursday evening on Commonwealth Avenue, and he said it with the conviction of a man who believed completely that he was the most valuable person in the vehicle. Eleanor did not cry. Marcus noted this specifically when he later recounted the story, that she did not cry, did not raise her voice, did not plead or fracture in any of the ways the moment might have broken another woman. She looked at Daniel for a long and particular moment, the kind of look that carries the full weight of everything a person has chosen not to say across years of careful watching. And then she gathered her prenatal folder and her bag, opened the door, and stepped out into the October rain on Commonwealth Avenue at 8:47 p.m., 6 months pregnant, in a camel wool coat. Daniel said nothing further. The Mercedes idled at the curb for 12 seconds before pulling away into the wet Boston dark, and Eleanor stood in the rain. And the story, the real story, the one Daniel Harrison had no idea he was living inside, entered its final act. The unraveling did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself with confrontation or public spectacle, because Elena Wellington had not been educated at Wharton and tutored in sovereign finance to settle for spectacle. She made one phone call that night, standing outside the hospital in the rain, to a quiet and formidable attorney named Margaret Osei, who had been retained for this contingency and who required only 7 words before she understood exactly what was being asked of her. By morning, the architecture of Daniel Harrison's professional and financial world had begun its quiet, systemic disassembly, the kind that does not make noise, but that leaves nothing standing. Business contacts that had been warm grew inexplicably distant. The logistics firm announced a restructuring that rendered his position redundant with the bureaucratic neutrality of a form letter. His adjunct contract was not renewed for the spring semester. The leased BMW was repossessed following a credit anomaly he could neither explain nor reverse. Victoria, to the surprise of absolutely no one with clear eyes, departed before the calendar turned the ambitious sales director, who had wanted a man ascending, discovered, with swift and graceless efficiency, that the man she had chosen was now descending, and she had not signed up for that particular journey. Daniel Harrison, who 4 months earlier had sat in a warm Mercedes and told his pregnant wife she did not bring enough to the table, found himself by February sitting in a considerably less impressive situation, with considerably less company, contemplating the architecture of choices he could no longer undo. There is a detail that people who knew the full story returned to often when they retold it, the way certain images attach themselves permanently to narratives of consequence. It was April, 7 months after the rain on Commonwealth Avenue, and Elena was seated in the front row of a Wellington Capital board meeting in a cream Chanel suit, her newborn daughter resting in a carrier against her chest, her dark hair composed, her posture carrying the unhurried authority of a woman occupying exactly the space she was always meant to occupy. Thomas Wellington sat 2 chairs to her left. Margaret Osei sat across the table. The camel coat was gone. The Macy's handbag was gone. The coupons, the Star Market runs, the carefully maintained ordinariness of 3 years of deliberate concealment, all of it had served its purpose and been quietly retired. When Daniel Harrison eventually saw the photograph, and he did see it, Because such photographs have a way of traveling to the people they are meant to reach, those who were present said he looked at it for a very long time without speaking. Victoria had been gone for months by then, and the BMW was gone, and the job was gone, and the woman he had put out into the rain on Commonwealth Avenue was seated at the head of a billion-dollar table, with their daughter sleeping peacefully against her heart. And there was nothing left for him to do with that information except carry it. There is a particular species of regret reserved for men who discard irreplaceable things in the belief that something better is waiting. A regret that does not diminish with time but instead calcifies, becoming part of the permanent architecture of a life. Daniel Harrison had earned that regret fully. And on the night he stood in the rain on Commonwealth Avenue, not literally, but in every way that mattered, he finally understood what he had done. Some men spend their entire lives learning what they had. Some learn it too late, in the back seat of a car, in 4 minutes, in the dark.